Hi, Gina. It is so nice to see you. Thank you so much for making time to be here today.
Thank you for having me.
So we know that you are a very well-known person in journalism, but I think just to get our audience acquainted with you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where are you from? How did you get into journalism? Um, Give us a little introduction.
Sure, and thanks for having me. Really nice to see everyone. So I'm Gina Chua. I'm the executive editor of Semafor, which is a brand new media startup founded by Ben Smith, who was the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed and the media correspondent for the New York Times, and Justin Smith, whose last job was at the CEO of Bloomberg Media. So this is a really exciting, brand new thing. I've never done a startup before in my life, so it's really it's kinetic and exciting. But really, my story of getting into journalism is completely by accident. I really just wanted to be a lawyer, and somebody said get a writing job, so I did. And then I wound up in radio, and then TV, and then in wire service, and in newspapers, and had a wonderful run from Singapore to Manila to Hanoi to Hong Kong and New York and Hong Kong and New York. And I mean, it's been fantastic. Journalism has been very good to me.
Huh. Very exciting. Well, I'm really keen to hear about your new job. I'm sure a lot of people are, but actually, I'm gonna slot that in later because we're here for the SOPA Awards ceremony, and we're here to celebrate journalism in Asia. So maybe let's start with talking about journalism in Asia first. I'm really curious to hear from you. What your thoughts are on some of the big challenges that we're facing today. And these are challenges, for reporters everywhere, but particularly here in Asia. I thought of, three different things. One, we have the rise of authoritarianism. We have, what you see happening in Hong Kong. China, it's getting harder and harder to report. We see what has happened in the Philippines this last week. And just in the last few years, I think especially for foreign journalists, yes, but also especially for local reporters, people who are from these countries, it's gotten more and more difficult to do their job. So I mean that is one big challenge I'd like to hear you talk about. What should we do? How do we respond to that? A second one is a problem that faces democratic societies as well, and that is disinformation, combating. I guess the fight for truth, if you will, combating the effects of social media and polarization and people only wanting to believe what they want to believe, even when there is space for good journalism out there. And then the third challenge is kind of the financial future of journalism, and that actually I'm quite curious to hear about, since you're in a startup now. I think a lot of news outlets around the world are struggling with changing business models and trying to figure out how to survive. And so not only how to protect journalists, keep them alive, keep them safe, help them to combat all the disinformation out there, and then also how to pay them. So those are kind of the three big challenges that I think we're facing here in Asia. And I'm wondering, what do you think about all these problems, how to solve them, what to do? Help us. Yeah.
So just like a really light, easy, happy subject for the night where we celebrate great journalism. Nice move. So I mean, look, you're right about all of these things, right? The space is getting tighter. The laws are getting more difficult. You just have to look at Hong Kong. I mean, at Reuters, of course, we had Wallon and Chua go to jail for a year and a half in Myanmar for doing their job, right? And you can see, sort of just general crackdowns. I mean, even without people going to jail or having their lives threatened, just the space for information has narrowed, largely across the region. And I think that's a real issue. Now, how do journalists address that? That's really difficult. I mean, I think we're blessed to have really courageous journalists, in many cases, local journalists, who are willing to test the boundaries of that and to do the work despite the threats and the challenges they face. But at some level, that has to be solved at a sort of a national and to some extent at an international level through mobilizing the population to understand that they need access to to information. It's not, freedom of information is not for us. Freedom of information is for them, and to help them understand we are not the enemy, we're trying to help them. I think that's a
Mm.
key issue, and that speaks to, I think, the other two challenges that we have, right? I mean, and it's not even just so much disinformation or misinformation, although those are real issues. And it's not exactly polarization, although that's also a real issue. There's just so many issues.
Mhm.
We have to promote facts. We have to replenish that stock of shared facts. But I don't think that's enough. I think that what we as an industry need to do, and to be honest, we haven't done as good a job of it as we should have, is really learn to reach those people who disagree with us. And I think that as audiences have become polarized, news organizations have become much more willing to speak to the audiences that do like them. And that makes perfect sense. It makes sense both from a
Mm.
psychic point of view, as well as, frankly, from an audience and business point of view. But I think that there is a gap where people are not reaching across the aisle, or we're not building engagement with the communities that are open to some kind of discussion. And I think that's a really important thing. And I think that news organizations need to focus much more on audience as much as on content that we produce. Great content is great, but it's important that it reaches the right people. And then, yes, business model. Well, I'm in a startup, so clearly I'm optimistic about this. Um, it is. I think that the relatively simple models that certainly I had growing up, printing a newspaper, running a TV station or a radio station. I mean, they've all gone away. Everything is multiple revenue streams, multiple experiments now. I'm broadly optimistic, but I recognize that the complexity has just gone up. Are you getting subscribers? Are you getting advertisers? Are you raising grant money? Do you do events on the side? And there's a lot of experimentation going on, and a whole flood of new nonprofits have come up in Asia doing some fantastic work. And I think that's a really good sign. Um, but I have to say, my optimism is based more on hope and belief than it is on concrete evidence. But I do think there are people who are working hard at this, and I think there's promising experiments going out there. And the future may not be huge, big media. It may be a lot of small media, and maybe that's a better thing. Maybe that's the way that we both reach a level of sustainability, and we reach the multiple audiences that I think we really have to.
I'm intrigued by what you said about um, the problem of the problem of reaching out to audiences that already agree with you, right? Or different outlets becoming more and more how do I say, like people reading what they want to agree with, and then also different publications or different media outlets also starting to lean in that same way. And you spoke about, there's this need for us to think about our audiences and to reach out to audiences who don't think the way that you do or who may not agree with you. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, again, back in the day, at least when I was starting out, audience development, because most major media had a monopoly on the audience. So if you were in a country and there were one or two major newspapers, you know, you sort of, you catered more or less to everyone. Did everyone like you? No, and probably a lot of people, wish there was some alternative, but they weren't, because it's expensive to set up a printing plant. And so you reached this audience, and there was, if you like, some level of shared discourse. I think one
Mm-hmm.
of the great things about the digital news is, of course, that you can open up much more quickly. Your barriers to entry are much lower. It also means that you understand your audiences much better, and I think that you tack towards the audiences that engage with your content. And that makes perfect sense. But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, it also, just as on social media, it drives people towards the further edges of discourse. I think that's the
Mm-hmm.
same thing that happens with news organizations. And so, for me, I think a huge part of where news organizations should go, at least those that are starting now and thinking about what they want to do, is to have less of a content first focus. In other words, don't say, I really want to cover X, and that's why I'm going to start my news organization focusing on subject X, but more I want to serve this community that is underserved. What do they need to know about, and what do they want to know about? And I'm going to build it around that. And I think if we can turn ourselves much more into an industry that thinks about how we what communities we serve and how we engage, and I don't mean pander to them, I mean serve them, then
Mm,
I think we take much bigger steps towards this idea of helping people understand the world better. I mean, the classic example, I think, is that it doesn't matter whether you're right wing or left wing or whatever. When you want the weather report is the same for everybody, right? And if you think if the street outside your house has a pothole and somebody's reporting on that, I mean, you can tell whether they're lying or they're not lying because you can see the pothole. It's less about, what's happening in the state capital or the national capital. And I think that we rebuild trust through that level of, real community reporting. And I think
mm,
that needs to be something that we all really think about as an industry.
mm. So that sounds like what I've heard quite a lot when people talk about the need for local news, right? And so the need for people to see that what they're reading or what they're watching, it matches the reality outside.
Right, and later on, when you tell them about something that's a bigger issue that they may not be able to witness themselves, they have more trust in you because they've seen that you are trustworthy on the things that they can verify. I mean, I'm on the board of a really exciting nonprofit in the U.S. called the Tiny News Collective, and it's really built around the idea that we're going to try and help seed very small 5-person newsrooms across the U.S. that all have to come in and say what community they're trying to serve and why it's underserved and how they can, how they're from the community and they're going to serve the community. I think those are really important things for us to think about.
How do you think that concept translates into foreign reporting? Or, for us, here, right, we're celebrating journalism in Asia, and I'm a foreign correspondent, and I was in China the last 3 years. Now I'm in Taiwan. But I'm just thinking about kind of this example you just gave. It it doesn't work in certain contexts, right? Like if you're in a country
No,
where,
it doesn't.
yeah. Well, so first of all, it doesn't work just in terms of, there's control over information. You don't have this free open space for different ideas. But then also, if you are a local reporter, you're a Chinese reporter, a reporter from Hong Kong, or a reporter in the Philippines or Myanmar, any of these places, and you're thinking like, I want to serve my community. I don't know, we're kind of getting to a place where it's getting so dangerous for so many citizens of these countries to report that it ends up being the foreigners and the kind of the outside news organizations that are the only ones that are oftentimes, they can do, they're the ones who can report. They maybe actually are not as good at reporting as the locals are, but they have this at least a little bit of protection, right? They can do it without being arrested in most cases. And just, so how do you think about that in the context of
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I was a foreign correspondent as well, including as a foreign correspondent in Singapore while I'm Singaporean, right? I I think by and large, it's clear that locals generally know more. I mean, I think we have to understand what the role of the foreign correspondent is. The foreign correspondent is there to explain a part of the world to folks back home, whoever it is that. So it's not that they're wrong about things; it's that their readers are interested in different things, right? They may not be interested in the local school board dispute, but they're interested in the national politics, and so you write about that, and I think that's fine. Again, this is
mm,
being very audience based, and the audience in
mm,
Johannesburg's interest in Taiwan is very different from the audience in Singapore and the audience in Taiwan. So I think the
mm,
first thing is to understand everybody does have a place. But I
mm,
do think obviously that increasingly and certainly from the time I started in journalism, we've seen many more locals fulfill the role that previously, that would be somebody parachuted in from another country. And I think that's great. I think that brings a lot
mm,
more local knowledge and understanding as long as they understand the audiences that they're writing for. But you're right
Mm,
in that I think it's perfectly possible for a foreigner to work for a local publication, and we know lots of people like that. I'm sure we have lots of friends who do that, and they do good jobs, especially if they're well integrated in society and they really understand things. So I don't discriminate between the two. I just think that obviously locals have more local knowledge. The
mm,
issue you raised though about how do you reach communities in places where the
yeah.
information landscape is severely constrained, that's a really
Mm,
tough question. And in some places we know it just can't be done. At least in terms of having reporters on the ground because of the risk to them. On the other hand, I think there have been some fantastic experiments with exile media. Certainly for many years during the uh, the time when the junta was originally in charge in Myanmar, as opposed to again, there was a lot of exile media that did a lot of good work, and they found innovative ways to get news to people. Now, it's true, it's very hard to serve multiple communities when you do that. But I think increasingly, as the space for information gets more and more constrained in some countries, we'll start to see a return to that sort of thing. And I think, again, Russia is probably another good example where we're going to see some of that, the best journalists, best Russian journalists probably start to set up exile media and try to reach
mm.
communities and audiences in Russia.
So I wanted to ask about, you mentioned this idea that in the past there were a lot of, local reporters were focused on their own communities, informing audiences around them, and foreign correspondents were flying in from far away and writing for a faraway audience. But nowadays there are more and more people who are from the countries they're covering, and then they're writing for foreign audiences. I'm curious to hear. You mentioned that you were a Singaporean foreign correspondent in Singapore. Could you tell us more about that? And could you also tell us, is that something that Semaphore is going to try to do more? I recall reading, I think, an example like that in a column, before the name was announced and so on. That maybe you don't need to parachute so many people in. Maybe you can get reporters who are from the countries they're in.
Yeah, I mean, I think Justin said that in an interview about the age of foreign correspondence. Well, so first of all, I was a correspondent in Singapore for Reuters, so I was technically a foreign correspondent. Reuters was not writing for Singaporeans. I mean, I think the Straits Times is probably a customer, but I wasn't really aiming to write for them. So what my goal was to write for a broad international audience, and luckily I had some great editors who would help me understand what it was that the rest of the world cared about in Singapore. So if you look at my clip file from back then, you'll see that the stories that I wrote for Reuters are probably very different from the stories that the Straits Times wrote. And that's perfectly fine because we have two different audiences that we're both trying to address. And they cared more about local issues. And I cared much more about issues that were of interest to an international audience. That's really just a question of understanding your audience well. And I think that that's not as much of an issue these days because people, travel a lot more. They are more international.
Mhm.
And if you've spent time in the country of your audience, I think you can understand what it is that they might be interested in. And so I think that there is a potentially good mix there. And again, as I say, I think the real issue here is knowledge and expertise, right? It's not that every local journalist knows more than every foreign journalist, and it's not that every foreign journalist knows more than every local journalist. Everyone comes in with a sort of a set of skills and knowledge. And so, when Justin talks about, the age of the foreign correspondent winding down, I think he's right, and I think that that's a trend that's already been happening. And certainly at Semaphore, what we want is we want people who know their beats. Now, in many cases, that will be a local person, but it doesn't have to be. If I want somebody who really understands climate
Mm,
change in a particular country, it may be that the best person on that story isn't a local because the best
mhm,
person maybe comes from a neighboring country. So I don't want to be dogmatic about it, but I do think that the idea is that we want people who have really intimate knowledge of a subject, whether that's a country
mm,
or a topic, um, and who have enough sort of cultural understanding. Um, and and really, at the end of the day, the key thing is for all reporters, whether foreign or local, to understand that their perspective is not the only perspective. I think that's where the danger lies. It's not, I flew in from New York and this is what the story is, any more than it's, I'm from Singapore, so I know what the story is. It's to understand that both people come to a story with, a set of experiences and a set of understandings, and that they may both be right and they may both be wrong, and that we just need enough humility to understand that there are
Mm.
all these multiple perspectives. And I think that it's really important as well for news organizations to find ways to make sure that those multiple perspectives are really reflected in stories. I think one of the issues we have in trust in media is that so much of those sort of embedded assumptions, I don't mean bias, I just mean, things we ourselves are blind to, are baked
Mhm.
into our stories. And I think when readers go through those stories, they, whether it's recognizable to them or not, I think that they have this sort of innate sense of, something, I'm not sure, something I don't quite agree with here. And, and I think we need to sort of help them unpack what are the assumptions in the story, and for us to frankly be more humble about saying there are other perspectives here, and I need to reflect them as well.
Can you give an example of that? Um,
Sure. I
assumptions
mean,
being taken into a what do you mean?
so this is one I've been talking to people about, which is, if you can always imagine a story that says, in a move likely to cost the government its majority, comma, the prime minister yesterday said X, right? And you look at that story and you say, well, okay, we know the prime minister said X, that was said in public, that's a fact, it's indisputable. And, I may disagree with you about whether that will cost him his majority, right? And so when you write a story that way, I think people who
Mm.
whether they're sort of sophisticated media readers or not, sort of say, well, something's not right here. I'm not sure why I agree or disagree with you, right? And I think that that story is far better written as the prime minister yesterday said X. You know, the
Mm.
analysis of many people is that this will cost him his parliamentary majority. It's also possible he won't, because this is the counter argument to, I think, sort of being more
Mm.
explicit about what is an
Mhm.
assumption in the story is a really important thing as we try to sort of square ourselves with readers again about
Mm.
what we bring to the table, and what we assume in a story.
It sounds to me like you came from Reuters, and it's like a more like, let's go back to like classic kind of Reuters AP, like facts, clear
No, it's
reporting.
not. It's not. No, no, no.
It's not?
To be fair, I think
Okay.
what it is it's certainly it's my personal animus towards
Uh,
dependent clauses, but
by the way,
really, I
it's not
mean, one of the reasons.
like that's not a negative thing.
But
Just
no,
uh,
but I no, I remember there was a wonderful quote in a story in the New York Times about embedded bias in stories. And
mhm.
and it was so telling and I recognized that I had never recognized it myself, which is, you can write a story in the US that says, Black people are often unable to get loans from banks. And if you read that sentence, you think, what's wrong with Black people and how can we help them? And do they need more financial literacy and so on? If you take exactly the same sentence, you turn it around and you say, banks often deny loans to Black people, the
Mm.
question you ask is, what's wrong with banks?
Yeah,
Should we
that's
regulate
good.
them better? Are they discriminatory? And I think that we need to understand, and we do because we say it, we need to understand the power of the words we put on a page, and the power of the images we put on a page, and the power of the design of information and graphics we put on a page. And for us to be
Mhm.
intentional, and sometimes the intentionality is bad, we're trying to manipulate someone, but let's hope that
Mhm.
we're not. And sometimes the design choice, if you like, the narrative choice
Mhm.
is unconscious. And I think that, again, this is a moment where the industry really does need to think very clearly about all this, both in terms of clearing themselves of, or ourselves of our embedded blind spots. But also, as we think about how we build trust and how we build engagement and relationships with our audiences, I think we
Mm.
just need to be much clearer about the language we use and the way we deploy it.
That's a really interesting example because you feel it right away, the huge difference in that. So you're not saying that the way you should write it is the percentage of loans that Black people get is much lower than other people, and it could be because the banks have a problem. It could be because Black people have a problem. You're saying we should be clear about if in our reporting we have figured out where the problem is, we should phrase it in a way that helps the
Yeah,
reader
or at
understand
least
that.
if we haven't
Mm-hmm.
solved it, I mean, if we don't know the answer, then let's just be clear. There are two choices here, and the point is,
Mm-hmm.
you may not have the right answer. I don't know. Is it the problem because
Yeah.
Black people are not good at applying for loans, or is it because the banks are discriminating? So let's say you don't know the answer. The point is, when you write the sentence, just think it through. Don't write
Mm-hmm.
the first sentence that comes to your head, because you are creating assumptions by the sentence you write.
Mm-hmm. So Um, so now I do really want to hear more about Semaphore. Um, what is it? How is it different from the news, all the different forms of news we have, all the publications that already exist? Is there something? I think kind of when myself and when a lot of other journalists saw that the startup was happening, it was interesting because it was so mysterious and there was this promise of it's something you haven't seen before, but like we still don't really know much about, how is it
Well,
different?
so
What is
I've
it?
only I've only been there for a few weeks at this point, 2 weeks actually,
Okay.
technically,
Okay.
as we record this. So
Mm,
so you might have to come and check in with me a little bit later. I mean, look, I think broadly, and I'm certainly not going to be talking about anything that isn't public yet. Broadly, I think we are trying to solve a number of the issues. One is just information overload, and people, have a ton of stuff, and they do want it,
mm,
in they do want to be able to consume the news more effectively and more efficiently. But also, I think these issues that we've talked about, which is the notion that there are multiple points of view and that you can't privilege one or two, and that there is by and large sort of a level, again, not wrongly, but for news organizations that are highly optimized to their audience, it's hard for them to optimize to multiple audiences. And I think what we want to do is come in and think about how that might be done. I think it's coming in and thinking
mm,
about how how multiple perspectives should be reflected in stories. And as Justin says, it's also moving away from the model of foreigners doing foreign reporting and locals doing local reporting, and sort of seeing how we can do a blend of those two. But I'm gonna take a rain check on giving you more details until we're ready to talk more about it.
Is it going to be a website, like a digital publication,
It will
something?
almost certainly be digital. I don't see us going out and buying a printing plant anywhere in the near future.
Okay, yeah, sad. I know that's not the future. um, okay, okay. So I don't think I've actually learned that much new about what it's going to do. Is semaphore really a common word in many languages? I guess it's not it's not common in Asian languages. Maybe that's why I'm not familiar with it.
No, probably not. It is the same word, I believe, in 35 languages. And for those people who are complaining about how it's spelled, that is how it's spelled. It's spelled differently in English, but in every other
Okay.
language, it's Semafor.
What does it mean?
Oh, well, multiple meanings. I'm glad you asked. Semaphore really does mean
Okay.
a way of sending signals. It's a French word, and back in the
Mm,
1800s, it was essentially one of the earliest forms of communicating over distances, and very effectively. So it's sort of a precursor to the telegraph, and so that's kind of a
mhm,
nice way of thinking about that. And then a Brit somewhere in the late 1800s invented flag semaphore, which is kind of what many of us think of as semaphore, which is sort of people with two flags standing on the bridge of a ship, and and signaling to somebody else on the other side. And then interestingly, semaphores actually a word that is used in computer science for gating of information. So there's a long
Hmm.
there's a long tradition of Semaphore being involved in information. So that's why it's a perfect word, as well as its international connotations of being the same in multiple languages. It's a nice metaphor, is Semaphore.
Okay. I just have two more questions. One question I do want to go back and ask something, and then I'll ask you that last advice question. Um, so Mike, I do have another question about the foreign correspondents versus local reporters question, because we talked a lot about audience and the different functions that these different kinds of journalists perform, the different people that they serve. But I think something that's always bothered me a lot is, aside from the fact that a local paper in Thailand is different, is it's going to have different content because it has a different audience. There's also just such a huge disparity in terms of power, in terms of protection, and also in terms of just financial support, right? For the big American and British international outlets versus these really sometimes really scrappy and really courageous tiny local media organizations on the ground. So what is should we kind of people who are with these much better funded, much more powerful, much safer media organizations, should we be doing something for the local reporters? Is there some way that should international news organizations be looking for ways to I don't know, like to when local reporters can no longer stay in their country, should we be trying to hire them? Like giving them jobs, giving them salaries that are closer to ours? Like what is there anything that our types of organizations should be doing, or do you think maybe that's not something we should be thinking about? This is just kind of how the world is. It's not equal.
I,
Um,
no, look, I mean, we are one big community, right? And I can tell you because I ran security at Reuters for 8 or 7 years, and when it comes to security, everyone is a colleague. We're not competitive on that at all, and I assure you that I was always talking to my counterparts elsewhere about things that were going on. Um, it is a real question, right? I mean, I was on a panel discussion about threats to democracy, and I was asked about security, and I said security is
yeah.
absolutely a resource question, right? Because there are going to be risks that situation is that not going to get any better, but you can mitigate some of those risks. But mitigating those risks, whether it's flak jackets or it's lawyers or frankly just counseling for mental health,
Mm,
requires resources, and it's difficult. I mean, I can tell you, I mean, I'm not at Reuters anymore, but at Reuters, the view was we train all our freelancers. Doesn't matter whether you work for us full time or not full time, you get security
mm,
training, you get security equipment, and in fact, we won't hire you unless you've done that. I mean, we won't take you on for a day job if you don't have that, and the assignment is risky. So I think that that the global media or the more well-funded media is doing some of these things, but obviously, Reuters or the AP or the New York Times or the Economist is not in a position to just go out and hire people um, because they're good people at risk, because there's not enough resources. There are organizations that are doing things, and I think there are more and more organizations that are thinking
mhm.
this through. So whether it's the Committee to Protect Journalists or the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, or organizations that are helping fund safe havens. There's
Yeah.
been a tremendous outpouring of support for evacuation from Afghanistan, for example, although much of that is also facing issues in terms of people getting actual visas at the end of the day, and that becomes a governmental problem. But certainly there was a
Mhm.
huge amount of support to try and get people, out of Kabul and safely into third locations. It's a huge problem. There is a strong I think sense that the non-governmental organizations are rallying around this to try and pull something together.
Mhm.
But everything you say is sadly quite true.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great policy that Reuters had. Um, but I mean, for me, for example, like I came from the China context, right? And it's like as much as you, it's like whatever you do and however much you want to protect and empower your Chinese colleagues, at the end of the day, it's like you come against the hard power of the state, and then
Yeah.
um, so, like that's that, right? And then at the end of the day,
Yes.
maybe I mean I do think one of the best scenarios that I have seen happening in the last few years is that with the expulsion of so many uh, foreign reporters from China, I have seen a bunch
Mhm.
of news organizations also move their Chinese staff out, like people who in China were only allowed to be researchers or news assistants, and now they are reporters and they're getting bylines, and
Exactly.
they're able to work in a much freer way. But but again, like you said, that is also a resource problem, right? I'm
Yeah.
sure it takes a lot of resources to do that and to support them, and there's visa issues, and yeah,
Exactly.
it takes a lot. But I'm happy to see. Well, I hope to. Well, I'm happy to see that Reuters has that policy, and I hope to see um, more news organizations, thinking about it. Um, yeah, and then um, oh man. So my last question is a little bit depressed. Actually, no, my last question is meant to be hopeful. So um, I wanted to ask you. So originally, I know that a lot of times, really experienced journalists, you'll get this question that's like, "Oh, what is your advice for people who are just starting out?" But I think a lot of people who are watching this actually will be, people who are receiving awards or who are finalists for the SOPA awards this year. And actually, my feeling, just based on being here the last few years, watching what's happened in Asia, around the world and in Asia, is that there are an awful lot of reporters who are just very, very burnt out right now, who are exhausted and tired and sad, and maybe even have won awards, but also have seen um, friends detained, have seen their countries kind of accelerating in a backwards direction. And it is really discouraging. And just, I'm wondering, well, one, and sometimes it makes you wonder kind of like, what is the point? Like, why are we still doing this? It's not changing things. And I wonder, have you ever felt that way or felt anything like that? And, what words of advice do you have for people who are just burnt out and sad? Reporters who are burnt out and sad.
So first, I want to say one, thank you for having me here. I just want to say my history with SOPA goes all the way back. I believe I was on the board of the editorial awards the second year SOPA existed. So like I go all the way back to with SOPA, and so like I see the great work, and I'm in awe of the journalists who manage to do this, and again, often at really difficult circumstances. So I think that that's great, and I think it's wonderful that they keep going. And I completely understand why people might feel a little burnt out, or even a lot burnt out. It's been, leaving aside the shrinking free expression space, it's been, a fairly brutal time with COVID, and certainly in some countries in Asia, it's been extremely brutal working through with COVID. So I think mental health is probably one of the biggest issues facing the profession, and that is not as well understood or not as well recognized as it should be. And again, it's a resource problem, but some of it can be mitigated simply by helping people understand, how to deal with, for example, social media, how to be able to switch off for a while, how to have other people check in with you, how to build a peer network in your organization. There are things that can be done that don't cost a huge amount of money. And I also completely understand when people say, I really just need to take some time off. I need to switch off from all of this. I need the sabbatical. I need, and I think that those are the sorts of things that that organizations can help facilitate, but it does begin with journalists recognizing in themselves that they're a point that they do need to take that break. On the other hand, I don't see that as bad for the industry. I think it's good for the industry. But over and above that, I see all of these bright, and I was like, now I'm going to sound old, right? But all of these bright young people who really want to get into the field, and maybe they feel they're going to make a difference, or maybe they're just feel, a moral mission to bring forth information that they think will help people, whether or not the people are receptive to that information. And I think that moral drive has always been a part of this industry. It's a part of other industries, doctors and so on as well. And I don't see any lessening of that. I see that in the in Gen Z, millennials, whatever the correct term is these days. And I think that's a really optimistic sign for industry, and you see it in the work that we recognize at the SOPA Awards. So I'm hopeful. I think more can be done to help them, but at the end of the day, I think we have a cohort that is prepared to carry the torch on for journalism, free expression, helping communities, and just helping people make better decisions about their lives.
Okay, so to finish, I think we just have some, fun questions to ask you at the end. What is the best book that you've read in the last year, or your favorite book you've read?
Oh, God, there's a great book called "Song in a Weary Throat." It's written by somebody called Polly Murray, who you've never heard of, but she's an incredibly smart legal mind who wrote some of the legal arguments that Ruth Bader Ginsburg used when she was arguing from the Supreme Court. And the best thing about Polly Murray is that they are Black, they are a civil rights activist, they were queer, they were transgender, and they were non-binary. So it's an amazing story, and everyone should read about them.
What is it called again?
Song in a Weary Throat.
Song in a Weary Throat. Okay.
I believe that's the name anyway.
Okay, I hope it is. Okay, second question. What is your favorite podcast?
I love listening to Ezra Klein interview anybody. We bought a pandemic car, and now when we drive, and we've got a nice 2-hour drive or hour-long drive, Ezra Klein is off talking to someone, and it is so smart and so interesting, and I learn so much every time.
Is there any story from the competition you've seen recently that you wished, well, I guess now it would be you wish Semaphore had written, that you wish your news publication had written?
I think we wished we would have written all of them.
Okay. Wait, okay. Well, I didn't mean the competition, like the ones that won. I think this question meant just any story. Okay. And then I guess you're in New York now, right? When was the last time you were in Asia?
I was in Singapore 2 months ago. First trip in 2 years.
Oh, okay. What was the first thing that you ate when you arrived?
Oh, see, this is where I made a mistake.
Oh, no.
I wound up staying in the middle of town, and like there's only a couple of things I really, really want in Singapore, which is bak kut teh, chicken rice, ice kacang, and laksa. And the only thing I got that was any good was laksa, and it's all my fault. I did not go to all the right places, so I'm very, very disappointed in my trip.
Oh, okay. Well, we hope you'll be back in the region soon, and you'll make up for it then. Okay, well, those are all the kind of lightning questions we have for you. So just want to say thank you so much for being with us here today. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.
And thank you for having me. And I hope the rest of the evening goes well, and everyone really enjoys and celebrates the great journalism that's on display.